All right, so looking at some other concepts, looking at some of these unique training parameters within special strengths, the idea of fillers and intra-workout resets. Um, and these are basically smaller exercises that you could kind of fit in between the different movements that you're doing within your training session. And really the difference between whether it's classified as a filler or an intra-workout reset, just sort of depends upon whether you're using it during a primary or a supplemental or assistance lift. So in other words, fillers are technically used during a primary movement. So during, like, for instance, again, a squat, bench press, or a deadlift, whereas fillers are used in between supplemental and accessory movements. So that's from I guess a terminology standpoint, what you look at as far as how they are actually implemented. So when you talk about fillers, again, so this will be like an exercise that you're going to use in between your sets of a primary movement. Okay, so in other words, like, again, take like the bench press, for instance. If you're doing a bench press, in between your bench press sets, you will do some other type of movement that may even be considered. Both of these are essentially like an extension of the warm-up. Okay, so for instance, a filler as a part of the warm-up for the bench press, you could be stretching out your lats or doing some band pull-aparts. That could function as a filler. Okay, again, the intra-workout resets are basically the same thing. They're just done in between the supplemental and accessory lifts. Okay, so again, same idea. You kind of pick a movement that, and it could be a mobility. It doesn't have to be a strengthening movement. It could be a mobility drill. It could be a stretch. You can be doing even self-myofascial release as a part of it if need be. Again, it's kind of almost, like I said, it's almost like an extension of the warm-up, if you will. So you kind of do like your warm-up, but you kind of continue it. And really, for the most part, particularly as it relates to the fillers, you only really want to do them for maybe like the first 2 or 3 sets of the primary movement. So in other words, you're not going to do it throughout the entire time. And you could also kind of use neural priming as a part of this. So again, with neural priming, basically what you're essentially doing is you're trying to, again, kind of activate a particular muscle group. So an example of like a neural priming would be like, doing some type of like high tension glute contraction prior to squatting or deadlifting. So in other words, like, you're deadlifting or you're squatting, in between your first couple sets, of your deadlifting and squatting, you do some sort of, isolation movement for the glutes where you're doing a lot of high tension, maybe like an iso glute bridge, and you're really holding it. The idea being is you're not necessarily looking to fatigue the muscle, but essentially what you're looking to do is you're looking to activate it, because that's like a muscle you'd want to have kind of prepped prior to doing those particular movements. So building the 3 conventional lifts, again, we look at ways to kind of, if we're looking at, squat, bench press, and deadlift, and you could look at throwing in the Olympic lifts if you want, but I'm just going to stick with these lifts for now. These tend to be sort of like the basis as far as athletic development, what you tend to use. Again, you want to be thinking about different variations that you can utilize in order to do this. We kind of talked about progressions and regressions as it relates to these particular movements, but that's really what you want to be thinking about. So when you're looking at all the different ways. So for instance, in the bench press, think of all the means, methods, bars that you can use to bench press with. Okay, so you can max effort bench, you could dynamic effort bench, you can use chains, bands in those. Basically all the different variations. If you think of the 245 class, we came up with all those lists of different exercises. Like, that's what you want to be thinking about, and not necessarily always using the conventional means. Again, maybe these are your sort of testing or indicator lifts, but you don't necessarily have to use them or train them the entire time. So getting into our special strength categorization. So now we're going to move here a little bit closer to talking about some specifics as it relates to how we could kind of classify special strengths within a a training program. So again, we talked about this earlier. We have the general preparatory. Again, general preparatory movements look at all around development. So again, these are going to be movements that are just going to kind of, if you will, get the person, work on their sort of, I guess, fitness, if you will, to kind of get them prepared. The general specific, again, this is still non-competitive, but it works similar muscle groups and in ways where the muscle work sort of is similar to the sport, but we're still not using the sport skill yet. So that's the key with this. And the general specific tends to kind of be like the one where, sometimes people have a little bit harder time with the classification, but again, look at the sport, look at whatever skills they have to do. Again, you're not replicating the skill, but you're doing something in a similar fashion, in a similar work regimen as the skill. And then obviously the special physical preparation is just specifically based on the sports skill. So this is the thing that looks closest to the sports skill. Again, if you just think of even like some basic drills that occur during a sport practice, that's typically what you look at with this particular sort of classification. So kind of getting into some examples of again, looking at this whole general physical preparedness and moving through general specifics. So some things that we could look at as some examples. So, if we looked at the track and field 100-meter dash, for instance. So if we looked at the 100-meter dash, right? So if let's look at a general exercise and then let's look at a general specific. So a general exercise for a 100-meter dash would be, say, for instance, an upright forward sled drag, right? Okay. So that would be just you're walking with you're basically power walking with a sled, walking forward, right? Why is that a general exercise? Well, you're working the muscle groups involved. You're basically strengthening the muscle groups involved, but it's not a sprint, right? You're not close enough to replicating that sprint. Whereas a general specific exercise, or what we would even at this point classify, so really your special strength exercises fall under the general specific, a prowler sprint, okay, where you're basically sprinting with a prowler. Okay, that would be a general specific. Why? Because if you think of the speed of movement, you're resisting it, the type of movement you're doing, that would have a greater carryover. Okay, obviously then just the exercise specific would be just actually running the special physical prep would be just doing a 100-meter dash. Okay, so that would be an example there. Okay, if we looked at a football running back carry, okay, so just a football running back, okay, a general exercise would be like a hip thrust, a single leg hip thrust, okay? You're working the posterior chain muscles as you would during a running back carry. A general specific exercise would be like say a zigzag prowler sprint, okay? So obviously a running back, they don't tend to run in a straight line for a very long period of time. So you would take that prowler now and have them run in a zigzag pattern with it. Okay, that would be your general specific. So you see how that kind of progresses as you kind of move along with this. If you look at, like, for instance, rebounding drills for basketball, okay, a barbell squat would be a general exercise, okay? So that would be your GPP. A depth jump would be your general specific exercise or your special strength exercise, because you're actually, again, now you're getting closer to kind of mimicking that, okay? So you kind of see how that kind of changes. And in some instances, what's maybe general specific for one type of movement is maybe only general exercise for another. So you're kind of seeing some of the differences, and we're going to do some activities where you get to kind of do this for some other sports and activities. So another way of looking at, or a way you could kind of categorize this. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, geez, is there an objective way to kind of knock off and kind of put in, well, how can we figure out how to, classify this maybe in an easier manner? Well, there is. So what we're going to look at here is the criteria. So basically, I'm going to list a bunch of criteria here as it relates to special strengths. And what you basically look to do is, does this exercise, how many of these boxes does this exercise check? Okay, so this is going to be a list that literally when you think of an exercise, you're going to look at it, look at what they have to do with their sport, how many things get checked off, okay? And again, it doesn't mean that if you don't check off a lot of stuff that it's necessarily a bad exercise. All it means is that you just have to understand what the carryover is going to be, okay? So if we were to go through this, so the muscle groups involved in the SPP sequence or exercise, okay? So you look at all you're basically doing is looking at the muscle groups, joint systems involved with the actual movement, okay? So in other words, does the exercise cover the muscle groups that are used in the movement? And in a lot of instances, no matter what the exercise is, this is probably going to be the case. So this is going to be a very common thing that gets kind of checked off, okay? Like if we go back to the rebounding example with the basketball player, right? So if they're just doing a regular barbell back squat, okay, the muscles involved are the same muscles that are going to be when they have to jump for a rebound, okay? This would be checked off, okay? Amplitude, the range of motion, and the direction of movement. So this looks at the joint angles, the range of motion at each joint, and the direction of the specific movement, okay? So that would be another thing you would look. Does that check off? So in other words, when you watch an athlete do whatever set activity, does the exercise have that involved? Okay, so the amplitude, range of motion, direction of movement. Okay, so for instance, if we were to go back to the track and field sprinter, the 100-meter sprinter, right, with the prowler sprint, right? Well, if we look at the amplitude and range of motion for a prowler sprint, particularly for the acceleration phase, yeah, it's going to mimic what they're doing. Okay, so the amplitude, range of motion, direction of movement, you could pretty much check that off. You'd be able to check that one off for that one. Actually, you'd be able to check off the first two. Okay, so that's another thing. The rate and time of maximal force production. So this is basically the speed at which maximal effort is expressed, okay? And basically how long it's expressed for. So again, you want to look at from a force production, how fast is force being produced, how much force is being produced, okay? So does that check out for a movement, okay? And this is sometimes where, particularly as it relates to strength movements in the weight room, where depending upon how you're doing it, this is where like some of that may be kind of separated from, okay? So that's something that you have to keep in mind as you're going through that. The accentuated region of force development or movement amplitude, okay? So when we're looking at this is effectively how the intensity of muscular contraction, force, and effort changes at the joint angle throughout the range of motion. So we know that with certain movements, those factors, again, the force, the effort, the intensity of muscle contraction, that could change throughout the range of motion, okay? So now we're getting into some things where, like, again, some basic exercises that we look at may start to get eliminated from that. Okay, the dynamics of the effort or the intensity of the effort. Okay, so again, it should at least match or exceed the targeted specific physical prep sequence. Okay, so you're basically looking at, is the intensity of the effort matched, at least matched, if not exceeds what has to go on with the movement. And then the last one is the regimen of muscular work. So you're looking at, well, what type of contractions are taking place? How is the muscle actually working? Okay, so basically, like every time you pick an exercise, particularly if you're looking for sort of this like continuum, you want to make sure that you can basically, see how many of these things you can check off. And again, it doesn't mean that if you can't check off a lot of things for it, doesn't mean that it's a worthless exercise. It's just, you just have to understand what that exercise is going to mean for their overall development. Okay. So for instance, if we were to just look at if we were just take a running back in football, okay, and we were to take the bench press, okay, the bench press really only works muscle groups that they need, okay, so really the bench press would really only be like a general prep exercise for running back in football. It doesn't mean that it makes the exercise worthless or that they shouldn't do it. It just means that, well, that's where that exercise falls. Okay. That's as opposed to maybe like some, lower body movements or sled-based exercise. Those could start to get more into general specific because now you start to kind of check off some of those items that they're doing. Okay. Really, for the most part, you're not going to check off all these for any one exercise unless you're really talking like a drill that's specifically related to the sport, okay? So a lot of the things that you see that would check off all of these things are basically like practice drills, okay? Which we could certainly be involved with, but obviously they spend a lot of time in those particular things as a part of like sport practice, whether it's whether it's non-traditional practice, stuff like that. So really our place, for the most part, is going to be in those first two categories. So we're looking to either, pick those things that maybe just start to check off a little bit more to kind of further strengthen the specific things, or if we have to create some level of general fitness related to them. Okay, so I've kind of shown this before. These are different sort of strength qualities and kind of where they fall on the force velocity curve. This could kind of also help you in kind of seeing a little bit more as it relates to how those sort of boxes that we talked about previously can get checked off. So if you kind of look at this this curve here, we see all the way on the end here we have speed, obviously velocity, force is a component. But so again, if you look at like a sprint, right? Yeah, there's force involved with sprint, but the problem is, particularly when you're at max velocity, okay, the ground contact time is so short, you don't have enough time to produce a ton of force, okay? There's still force produced, but when you're at max velocity, you're really at a point where your ground contact time is so short, it's hard to produce a lot of force. You see, the longer time you go, you get towards maximal strength. So a lot of force, but not a lot of speed involved. And then you kind of have all of this in between. So again, every athlete to some degree, it doesn't matter whether an endurance athlete, more of a speed power athlete, they have to kind of work this curve at some point, okay? And we've talked about parameters, speed, strength, power, strength, speed, and kind of what that means and ways that you can manipulate that in the weight room. All right, so looking at special strengths, again, coming back to this idea of trying to look at different types of sport activities that we look at. So we have our special strengths means that we look at. So these are kind of all just sort of general movement things that we could look at pretty much in most sports, and we could look to find ways to sort of address it, right? So obviously sprinting is an important part of really most sports that we look at. Yeah, so we look at basically ways we could look to build the sprint, whether that's through loaded sleds, unilateral strength movements, different types of jumping variations carry over to sprints, and just various types of resisted sprint training could all kind of fall underneath that. Jumping and kicking, okay, obviously kicking is not important for all sports, but there are some sports where that's relevant. Jumping's probably relevant to most. So a lot of your dynamic effort training could carry over to this. Obviously, jumping variations carry into this, and a lot of jump and throw combinations could certainly also look to enhance that area of special strength. Throw, punch, block. Okay, so here now we're kind of moving into the upper body. So again, here we're just basically looking at upper body strengthening, whether it's more pure strength or just even, things that are more ballistic or more explosive in nature. So different types of medicine ball throw combinations. There's actually sled dragging you could do for the upper body that can help to replicate this. Some different things that could apply for that. And then grappling and grip strength. Again, basically anything that would address grip strength. Carries could kind of fall under this as well, as far as kind of carry over to grappling and grip strength. So daily programming, so this kind of takes us back to kind of looking at, so how can we really look to prep our sort of daily training, if you will, okay? And again, this definitely isn't anything new, but again, it could kind of remind us, like when we're kind of setting up our structure for training, how we can kind of do it very effectively. Obviously, we start up with our warm-up and preparation, and again, even within the warm-up and prep, we could kind of parse things out to kind of how we sort of look to address what's going on with the individual. Then next would be your CNS, any type of CNS intensive activity. And again, this could kind of bleed into the next category, but what I would say it again, when you're looking at power and speed development, you're jumping, you're sprinting, that sort of thing would definitely be done next. Or if that's the CNS intensive, if we're just talking about, again, you don't necessarily have to do all of these things in one day. This could be an entire day of training. If you were to just go right into your strength work, obviously your CNS intensive lift for the day would be typically the first thing you would look to do, okay? Then you'd have, again, strength training. This could be part of the CNS intensive activity, particularly if you're doing some type of max effort or dynamic effort lift. But that would kind of be your next priority, followed by your supplemental and accessory movements. Then next would be any type of core training or anti-movement patterns, keeping in mind that you could do some of this as a part of the warm-up. I would say the difference when doing core training in this spot versus doing it as a part of the warm-up, when you're doing it as part of the warm-up, you kind of want to make sure that you're not per se fatiguing the core. So your core training, if you're placing it here, and you could do it in both, this is where now, like from a set reps perspective, you could kind of look to fatigue the muscles, whereas if you're doing them as a part of the warm-up, you're just trying to activate them. Remember, we talked about in the warm-up, they're kind of nice because of what happens, particularly at the hips with the range of motion, so that could be something you look to incorporate. Any energy system training, because again, here you're looking to address metabolic fatigue. So again, if you're doing anything as it relates to capacity of the energy systems, that could come afterwards. And then obviously your recovery. We didn't talk a ton about recovery in this, but any recovery means could then be done at the end. A lot of people like to just do even like parasympathetic breathing at the end of a training session, particularly if there was a lot of high CNS activity, almost as like a cool down. We probably tend to neglect cool down a lot, but certainly still something that is beneficial to the athlete, so you may want to look to address that. All right, and then our last topic we're going to look at within the next couple slides, we're just going to look at hypertrophy considerations for athletes. So a lot of what we talked about kind of focused on sort of like that, functional kind of neurological carryover, I guess, if you will. But obviously we know that, and really all athletes to a degree are going to need some form of muscle hypertrophy, okay? Again, it could vary based upon the athlete. Obviously a down lineman, shot putter, that sort of athlete, obviously muscle hypertrophy is a really big consideration. A running back, a sprinter, not as much, but there again, there's a little bit of benefit to hypertrophy as far as it carrying over for muscular strength. So, we certainly still want to address muscle hypertrophy to a degree. Again, when we look at some basics that really kind of work very well with muscle hypertrophy, vary your rep range and loads. Again, these are just some simple things to be thinking about. And again, they're simple ideas. They're not really hard things. People are always trying to find, like, again, a super magical way to address these things, and sometimes they just sort of are maybe missing out on some basics that they could certainly look to consider. But again, if you kind of vary your rep ranges, again, in our basic strength and conditioning literature, we tend to talk about 6 to 12 reps. As I've mentioned before with a lot of the recent research, particularly in hypertrophy, you can actually get hypertrophy benefits up to even like 30 repetitions. Okay, now I'd be careful what exercises you do for 30 reps, but there's actually a much larger varying rep range in the literature that's showing that, hey, you could even get pretty decent hypertrophy up to even 30 reps. And what that could essentially mean is that, obviously you're not using as much weight with 30 reps. So like from a fatigue standpoint, it may not get in your way as much. Vary your exercises, obviously in a careful way, but you want to do that. Vary your tools used, and then again, vary movement patterns and angles. So again, key with variation is not to get crazy with it, but obviously varying it could kind of create, stress. Variation itself is a stress to the body, so it's not just do it for the sake of doing it, but, doing it in a controlled manner. I've always had a habit of kind of keeping, sort of like training blocks to about a 3 to 4 week span for athletes who've trained a lot. So in other words, for those 3 to 4 weeks, they're pretty much using, for the most part, the same exercises and maybe just trying to add a little volume or push them a little bit more. For younger athletes, I keep it the same a little bit longer, kind of push that out to 6 to 8 weeks, but then again, starting to change or vary the movement after that. As far as considerations as it relates to muscle damage, so we know that muscular damage is actually a trigger for hypertrophy. So eccentric focused, again, making sure to kind of slow down that eccentric. And again, you could do this with both primary lifts and secondary or accessory lifts. I've tended to have individuals now with pretty much always do their accessory lifts with at least a 3-second eccentric. Because essentially with your accessory lifts, you're really working on muscle hypertrophy and balance regardless for the most part anyway. So doing a little bit of a slower eccentric, and again, you're not really looking to push weights, as fast with those particular movements. Like for instance, like a tricep press down. If I'm having someone do a tricep press down, they're probably almost always doing at least a 3-second, if not a 5-second eccentric, I think is good to do. This kind of goes with the idea of time under tension. So again, even doing like you could do if you wanted to time sets. If you want it. So, and again, just increasing the eccentric portion itself is going to increase time under tension alone. Okay. You could obviously do, you could obviously take that a step further, and you could even have them do the concentric action slow and controlled. That will further increase the time under tension. But at the very least, doing the eccentric in a controlled manner is certainly going to do that. So some ways that you can address metabolic stress, okay? So we've kind of looked at, muscle tension focus based on kind of variation. We've looked at inducing muscular damage. Now we just look at metabolic stress. So, another trigger, if you will, for muscle hypertrophy is the buildup of metabolites. So when a muscle's working for a certain period of time, the metabolites that build up can also be a trigger for hypertrophy. So time under tension functions with this as well. Obviously, if the muscle's under tension for a more prolonged period of time, that's going to build up metabolic stress. So much like we said with muscle damage, this will be the same thing. So again, the eccentric, if you will, can also kind of carry into this because you'll have increased metabolic stress. Rest pause training. So rest pause training is when you kind of you take a certain say you're taking an exercise. So let's just take a dumbbell bench press, for instance. You basically take short predefined rest periods within a greater percentage of the range of motion. Okay, so basically what you'll do is you'll take you'll look to take what would be maybe a 12 rep max in like a dumbbell bench press, but you're really looking to get a total of maybe like 20 to 25 reps. So you're obviously not going to be able to do that in one set. So what you'll do is you'll knock out, like, again, 10 to 12 reps because it's a 10 to 12 rep max. And then what you'll do is you'll take shorter rest periods and try to get as many reps as you can. Okay. So again, take your 12 rep max in a dumbbell bench press. First set, you're probably only going to get about 12 reps. You rest about 15 seconds, and you try to knock out as many reps as you can. You're probably going to get about maybe 3 to 5 more. Rest 15 seconds, do another set. And you'll try to hit like a rep total. Or maybe you'll just say, I'm going to do 4 rest pauses and track how many total reps I get. Okay? That'll basically be what you're looking to do with that. Supersets, giant sets, drop sets. So again, supersets are just performing 2 non-competing exercises back to back. Again, that's just kind of a way to save time within your workout. Giant sets are when you perform 3 or more exercises back to back, and then you have your drop sets. Drop sets are something where basically you perform an exercise with a load, and then immediately with no rest, you drop the load and you continue the set. Okay, so unlike a rest pause where you'll give yourself a little bit of a rest, you're basically going to just immediately drop the load and get right into your next set. Okay, so say you were doing lat pull downs with 150 pounds. You get 8 reps with that 150 pounds, you drop down to 120, and then you try to get as many reps as you can after that. Rep-based sets. So here's where basically you just say, again, take a moderate to heavy weight, and you basically try to get a certain amount of reps, stopping as few times as possible. So this is kind of like a combination of using rest pause. You're basically going to use rest pauses with this, but basically what you say is, you know what, I'm going to do 50 reps of, again, I'll just say dumbbell presses, and you pick a weight where, you know, you're going to get somewhere between maybe 12 and 15 reps at a first shot, and basically all you're trying to do is do as few sets as possible to get to that 100 reps. And then time-based sets is basically where you just pick a time frame, and during that entire time frame you just do it. Okay, this is a really good way to kind of quantify your time under tension, because obviously, you know, if you say, okay, I'm going to do tricep press downs for 30 seconds, well, you're doing them for 30 seconds, so you know that you have that much time under tension. And basically you're just going to pick a weight, and you're just going to get basically as much as you can done within that 30 seconds. So really it's just another way of kind of, and you could kind of almost look at that as sort of, because you may have to take even some rest pauses early on with like a certain weight, but it's just a different way to look at that. And then the last one we'll look at is constant tension sets. So a constant tension set is basically a technique that you use where basically involve just keeping tension on the muscle. So you never do a lockout with this. So basically what you do is at the end range, you kind of stop just before the end range and you just keep working. Typically you want to do that for your submaximal supplemental lifts where you're just looking to get some high volume. So you're never really looking to rest, you're just basically looking to continue with constant tension on the muscle. And these are the learning outcomes that I listed. So again, just some different ways to look at strengthening and some ways to categorize your exercises.